You have not experienced Shakespeare until you have read him in the original Klingon.
After 5 movies, it was looking like the original crew of the Starship Enterprise was like that milk in the fridge with a dodgy best before date. Hey, it hasn't expired technically, but there is an odd whiff.
Yes.
But as nobody wanted Star Trek V to be the final frontier, plans were made for a 6th entry to the franchise as a final, absolutely very last frontier. Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country.
Guess who's coming to dinner?
1989's Star Trek V, The Final Frontier, directed by Captain Kirk himself, William Shatner, was one of those films where things did not go so well, like the crew of a supertanker carrying crude oil inadvisedly celebrating Guy Fawkes Night. The film's performance at the box office was softer than shortbread dipped in coffee. While the movie had been up against very strong competition at the multiplexes that summer, Star Trek V was in no way strong competition. It was just not particularly good in any meaningful way, leaving a sour taste in the mouths of fans, moviegoers, the cast, the crew, and the studio. Nobody wanted to end on a duff note.
Spock, you want to know something? Everybody's human.
I find that remark insulting.
So how about popping a Spock on a Star Trek VI and getting it done for Star Trek's 25th anniversary in 1991? Sure, great. So long as William Shatner stayed in the captain's chair and went nowhere near the director's chair.
Right.
Captain Sulu has just finished his first mission as the captain of the Excelsior when the ship is hit by a shockwave.
Do we report this, sir?
Are you kidding?
Praxis, a Klingon moon producing most of the Empire's energy, explodes, leaving the Klingon Empire with a choice: pursue peace with the Federation or die. There was also a third option, which was to hold a raffle where the main prize was a signed photograph of Alf, the most popular imported TV series on the Klingon homeworld. But ticket sales were disappointing, so peace it is.
The Klingon Empire has roughly 50 years of life left to it.
Starfleet assigns the Enterprise to escort the Klingons' Dove Chancellor Gorkon, who's outlined a plan for peace between the Klingons and the Federation.
I have personally vouched for you in this matter, Captain.
You have personally vouched?
Kirk is a bit miffed for several reasons. Firstly, Spock's volunteered them for the mission without first consulting him, and then there's the matter of the Klingons having killed his son.
I could never forgive them for the death of my boy.
And then there's the infamous clip posted on Klingon social media.
Klingon bastard, kill my son! Klingon bastard, kill my son!
The Enterprise crew are due for retirement, and most of them seem ready to kick back and not have to worry about awkwardly lurching from side to side, since that does a number on your hip. The Enterprise's new helmsman, Lieutenant Valeris, is Spock's protege and is as good-humoured as you might expect from a Vulcan.
I don't believe so, sir.
She's a Vulcan, all right.
The Enterprise rendezvous with the Klingon battlecruiser ferrying Chancellor Gorkon, his daughter Azatbur, as well as General Chang, a guy even more fond of quoting Shakespeare than an out-of-work actor temping as a high school drama teacher. A dinner party to break the ice goes, well, poorly. I mean, we've all been there when the host asks if you want coffee and then busts out the slide projector and 300 pictures detailing their kid's birthday party at Chuck E. Cheese.
We need breathing room.
Earth, Hitler, 1938.
As the crew nurse their regrets and their hangovers,
You know anything about a radiation surge?
Only the size of my head.
Enterprise appears to fire on the Klingon vessel, seriously damaging it to the point where the artificial gravity has failed. Two figures clad in Starfleet spacesuits and magnetic boots arrive and start shooting anybody they come across, including the Chancellor.
We come in peace, and you blatantly defy that peace.
Rather than start a war, Kirk surrenders to Chang and he and McCoy transport across to the Klingon ship to render assistance. They're arrested and then the fun really begins.
Admiral Kirk was broken for taking matters into his own hands in defiance of regulations of the law. Do you deny being demoted for these charges? Don't wait for the translation! Answer me now! Kirk and McCoy are subjected to a show trial, which goes about as well as expected when they are sentenced to life imprisonment in the penal colony on Rurapenta. Rurapenta is not a ski resort, nor is there a hotel carved out of ice that only serves vodka with reindeer sliders. It is in fact an underground dilithium mining operation surrounded by a frozen wasteland. It's less a winter wonderland and more a nightmare with snot frozen to your face 24/7. In the camp, Kirk and McCoy are befriended by Martia, who gives them a background briefing and conspires with them to escape. The Federation have their hands tied, diplomatically speaking. They're unable to do anything about Kirk and McCoy if they want a peace treaty signed, so they can take no action to recover their personnel, which includes a planned rescue attempt by this guy, which of course depends on which version of the film you're watching.
On the Enterprise, an investigation is conducted to work out why they have a full complement of torpedoes, yet their computer tells them they fired.
This ship fired those torpedoes. If we did, the killers are here. If we did not, whoever altered the databanks is here.
Spearheaded by Lieutenant Valeris and Inspector Chekhov.
Why not simply vaporize them?
Like this?
They eventually find the evidence, and also 2 dead assassins. As the old saying goes, to find 1 dead assassin may be an accident, but finding 2 dead assassins is a scene in a John Wick movie. Which means there's still at least 1 conspirator at large on board the ship. Martia will do anything to get out of the prison, but claims she needs Kirk to get them off the planet before they freeze on the surface. She also has another party piece. I mean, cool, it does save a lot of time getting ready for a Halloween party, and at least you never have to worry about turning up in the same costume as another guest. Unless, of course, your sister was also invited. Once on the surface, the other shoe drops. This has all been an elaborate setup to have Kirk and McCoy killed while trying to escape. Not for the first time, Kirk must wrestle with himself.
Can't believe I kissed you. Must have been your lifelong ambition.
Before he and McCoy are about to be executed, but not before being told the entire plot.
Klingons have a new weapon, a bird of prey that can fire when cloaked.
Back on board the ship, there's still a matter of the traitor. Oh dear.
Names, Lieutenant.
I do not remember.
Vulcan mind melds have, to this point, been treated almost as therapeutic and cathartic, but in this case it's used as a means of tortuous interrogation. I can only be thankful that my 2nd grade teacher, Miss Bells, did not have access to such mind meld techniques, otherwise she may have found out who really wrote Miss Bell's piss smells on the chalkboard. Everything's falling into place. Chang has a bird of prey that can uniquely fire its weapon while still cloaked. He's conspired with some anti-Klingon Federation personnel like Admiral Cartwright and the Romulan ambassador to kibosh the peace deal, which, if nothing else, is a sign that when we put our heads together, we can all work together for the common evil.
Cry havoc! And let's slip the dogs of war!
With help from Sulu and the Excelsior, Chang is sent to hell, while everyone races to stop another assassination at the Khitomer Peace Conference. If you watch this film on home video or watched the later director's cut, you'll see a little bit extra. The assassin was in fact Starfleet officer Colonel West in a mask. The Enterprise crew, having saved the galaxy,
We're to put back to space dock immediately, to be decommissioned.
If I were human, I believe my response would be, go to hell.
but there's one last trip before retirement. Which, might be difficult since technically they have no helmsman to actually pilot the ship. The end. After the bitter aftertaste of Star Trek V: The Final Frontier, the cinematic equivalent of preparing for a colonoscopy, it was really nice to see the crew back in such a good film, and one that was really, really Star Trek. It's not an outright action film or an outright comedy like 2 or 4, the other films in the series that were well received by fans and casual viewers. It's got a little action here and there, but this plays more like a political thriller, delivered beautifully by returning Star Trek II director Nicholas Meyer. With Star Trek VI, the even-numbered film good, odd-numbered film bad way of rating Star Trek films was cemented for at least another decade, and it was almost something entirely different. Star Trek The Next Generation had by 1990 found its feet and had finally become its own thing and popular in its own right. The thinking was that future Star Trek films would probably revolve around the crew of the Enterprise D. Harve Bennett, the executive producer of Star Trek films since Wrath of Khan, had pitched an idea to the studio that was dear to his heart, a prequel movie showing young Jim, Kirk and Spock meeting for the first time at Starfleet Academy. Great idea, said the studio, no more having to make deals with an aging cast. Terrible idea, said the aging cast, who knew that unless they made more Star Trek films, George Takei's passport story would bore convention goers to tears for decades to come. The Academy film idea was nixed, and Bennett decided he was done with Star Trek.
Excellent. I mean, too bad.
His relationship with some of the cast had soured during recent films, particularly with Nimoy, who now assumed the mantle of executive producer for the new project, tentatively and of course imaginatively titled Star Trek VI. This was also highly inconvenient for anybody who counts with their fingers, since now you need to put down your soda to count to number 6. Nimoy approached Nicholas Meyer, who had salvaged the script for Star Trek II and directed what was the best film to date. He'd also co-written the fourth film, which was the most successful Trek film to date. The pair hashed out a concept which would mirror the geopolitics of Earth in 1990, the fall of the Berlin Wall, opening up of the Eastern Bloc, the Chernobyl disaster, and the looming end to the Cold War. Of course, it's science fiction, so Chernobyl accident becomes Klingon moon praxis, Berlin Wall became the neutral zone, and Chancellor Gorkon was modelled on Gorbachev.
There's an old Vulcan proverb. Only Nixon could go to China.
The studio executive games meant Meyer was sidelined on the script side for a time, as one executive pushed two writers already under contract to the studio. Nimoy held firm, pointed to his sharpened ears and stated, "Great, but no, Nick Meyer is writing and directing." Meyer brought in his assistant Denny Martin Flynn to co-write the film, partly as a way to help Flynn get through some tough medical issues at the time. Flynn would work in Los Angeles while Meyer was living in London, the pair collaborating thanks to a marvellous new-fangled thing called email. This was not just before broadband, this was before a single America Online disc had seen landfill.
Don't believe them. Don't trust them.
They are dying.
Let them die.
Gene Roddenberry, of course, hated the script, since it showed the Federation personnel being hostile towards the idea of peace with the Klingons. Shatner also wasn't keen on Kirk being such a curmudgeon by this stage, but unlike previous films, he would make fewer demands on the script.
How on earth can history get past people like me?
This was a film where a few of the principals would defer some of their payments in order for the film to get made. Paramount, having originally agreed to a budget of $30 million, the same as Star Trek V a few years earlier, began to haggle, particularly in the wake of some poorly performing releases at the time. Not mentioning any names, but it sounds a bit like the Fodgather Cart Tree. At the time, the studio's executive positions were in flux. When Meyer stood firm on a $30 million budget, the movie was briefly cancelled, before another studio leadership change resulted in a green light with the original budget. Playing poker with Paramount executives sounds like a lot of fun, so long as you don't run out of pennies.
Too rich for my blood.
Part of the budget crunch meant the film's original opening was nixed. The film would have started with the Enterprise crew already retired, and they'd have to be reformed one by one, in a getting the band back together style sequence.
That suits me, I just bought a boat.
Nick Meyer's direction is solid, wringing all of the tension out of the script with camera work that complements the action well. There are a few variations of the film. The theatrical version was fine, but the home video version added the subplot of Colonel West's briefing and of him being the assassin in a Klingon mask. The director's cut debuting on DVD also added the visual flashbacks during Spock's interrogation of Valeris.
This way. I think you might enjoy a brief tour.
William Shatner's performance is solid, but it's not Kirk of old, it's just old Kirk, accepting his age and his approaching retirement from Starfleet. Kirk has to try and reconcile his hatred of the Klingons with his duty, which here is to make the peace happen and to defend it.
Signal our surrender.
Captain?
We surrender!
So Kirk grows a little. A large portion of the film is Shatner and DeForrest Kelley, an ever-reliable duo, as they try to work out whether they can trust Martia, played by Iman, the supermodel who was also, by this time, Mrs. Bowie.
I thought I would assume a pleasing shape.
DeForrest Kelley as McCoy has mellowed a lot by this point. He's more weary of the latest situation he's in rather than argumentative. He also doesn't have Spock to play off of.
Logic is the beginning of wisdom, Valeris, not the end.
Leonard Nimoy as Spock is in full investigation mode. He initially delegates the search for evidence to Valeris, but realizes too late that he's put the absolute very worst person in charge of the quest. Spock is visibly angry at Valeris' betrayal.
You have to shoot.
I do not want to.
What you want is irrelevant. What you've chosen is at hand.
Kim Catrall does an excellent job as the intense Valeris. The initial idea was for the character to be Savick, and Kirstie Alley couldn't be coaxed back. Catrall also didn't want to be yet another person playing that character. There was also static from Roddenberry, who hated the idea of that character turning traitor, or indeed of that particular character having any character. George Takei spends most of the time on his own ship, which makes far more sense than the crew of the Enterprise, who are all captains and commanders. Nichelle Nichols and James Doohan get to do a little more than just spout technical lines, and Walter Koenig becomes the source of much of the film's humour. Nick Meyer insisted that even with the film's tight budget, that he had to get the best actors for the roles. David Warner pops up as Gorkon, his second role in Star Trek.
The game's afoot, huh?
And Christopher Plummer sinks his teeth so far into the scenery that he had to be tasting wood shavings for weeks.
Once more unto the breach, dear friends.
Chang spouts Shakespeare whenever possible, like a college student who's just read 3 chapters on Sartre and won't stop wanking on about Sartre.
I am constant as the northern star.
I'd give real money if he'd shut up.
It is a truly excellent cast. And for shits and giggles, there's Christian Slater. His mother was the casting director, so he had to appear in the film, otherwise he'd have to go to bed without dinner. In the smaller roles, there are a lot of people who will appear again in various Trek series. Kurtwood Smith, Brock Peters, and in the director's cut, Renee Auberjonois. Michael Dorn also appears to play his Next Generation character's ancestor, Colonel Worf. And of course, David Warner would later create an iconic character obsessed with lighting. Mark Leonard as Sarek and Grace Lee Whitney as Rand return to roles they've played since the 1960s. Despite this supposedly being the last Trek to feature the main crew, all bar DeForrest, Kelley and Nichelle Nichols would at least make one more appearance in an official Star Trek project on television or in a film.
He was just about to explain the whole thing. You want to go back?
Absolutely not.
Let's go.
In order to promote the film, executive producer Leonard Nimoy agreed to pop a Spock in the episodes of Star Trek The Next Generation, in a story that is somewhat linked to events in the film, but told in a way that in no way spoils the film. And for those obsessed with trivia, this is the first on-screen and live-action confirmation of Sulu's first name Hikaru and Kirk's middle name
Tiberius.
Shakespeare's play Hamlet mentions the undiscovered country as a metaphor for death, and Once Upon a Time Undiscovered Country was a possible subtitle for Star Trek 2, which makes a lot of sense in terms of that script. Meyer's direction here is efficient and tells the story well, even if the explanation for Spock knowing where to beam up the Captain and McCoy wasn't always apparent unless you really paid attention.
I'm wearing a Viridian patch on my back.
Rather than have a repeat of the special effects drama and disappointment of the previous film, ILM was once again engaged, providing effects that really hold up well. Paramount has gotten a fair bit of mileage out of this film's effects. Computer graphics had been used in a Star Trek film before, but as actual computer graphics on a monitor. Here, ILM manages to give us something new: weightless Klingon blood. Oh, and since it's the early 90s, morphing. Gene Roddenberry was shown the film and said he liked it. Unfortunately, his health issues had taken their toll, and the great bird of the galaxy passed away just a few days later.
As much to the crew of the Enterprise, I owe you my thanks.
Nice to see you in action one more time, Captain Kirk.
The film's score has a darker feel from newcomer Cliff Idleman. It's not the most hummable score, but it suits the film really well.
Are you fond of Shakespeare?
This being both a Paramount film and a Star Trek film, money was saved wherever possible, reusing and repurposing existing sets and costumes from previous films, or borrowing whatever they could from Star Trek The Next Generation. Some stand-ins were filmed on an actual glacier in Alaska to give the film some texture. Apart from some mocked-up ice planet locations filmed not far from the studio complex, the film was lensed almost entirely on the sound stages. Remember when William Shatner was frustrated by the budget cuts for Star Trek V? Well, a few years later, on the same budget, not accounting for inflation, we got this film, which goes to prove all you need to make a great Star Trek film with $30 million is a good idea, a good script, a good cast, a good director, and ILM. Basically do the opposite of Star Trek V.
Surprise!
The other thing that this film did differently from Star Trek V, well, it was well reviewed. It was enjoyable and did well enough worldwide on its 1991 release that almost everybody was happy with it. Star Trek was at the time a franchise where if you didn't make your money back in North America, you likely weren't going to make it back. The film was originally meant to end with the crew adding their signatures into the ship's final log entry. Somewhere along the line, that became the cast adding their signatures. I do sympathise with the poor bastard who had to animate Jimmy Doohan's signature.
We too, you and I, have grown so old and so inflexible that we have outlived our usefulness.
As we've said, Star Trek VI was the final film to feature all of the original cast and ended up as a fitting way to say goodbye to the beloved characters, at least until most of them show up in something else later on.
That's more than a coincidence.
In 1996, to celebrate the show's 30th anniversary, an episode of Star Trek Voyager revisited the Excelsior during the events of this film, where it placed Tuvok as a crewman on the ship. The next Star Trek film would indeed feature the cast of Star Trek The Next Generation, but also a few original cast members, in a film where the bald and the beautiful joined forces, though honestly I'm not sure which is which.
Would that constitute a joke?
If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, leave a comment below, or check out some of our other videos.
Klingon bastard, kill my son! Klingon bastard, kill my son!